So good evening, everyone. Welcome. I welcome all of you. Faces I recognize, or faces I don't recognize. But after all, faces are just faces. The most important thing is soul communion. I'm always very intrigued by different people when they meet you after haven't seen you for a little while. So different people greet you in different ways. I mean, beyond the hello and all that. Like, for instance, oh, I like your glasses, think. And some people don't even notice your glasses. Obviously, as the Talmud says, we all project. Whatever matters to you, that's how you project on others. And people, I guess, who are into glasses, spectacles, and check it and spend some time in the mirror. I don't know if you've ever estimated how much time you spend in the mirror on a daily basis. Mirror on the wall. But I will tell you, there was a tzaddik, and he never looked in a mirror in his entire life. It's considered to be like an act of vanity. Not to say it's a sin or anything, and I am not from the fire and brimstone type that's trying to forbid looking into mirrors. I think for many people it's probably healthier to look in a mirror once in a while. But he didn't look into a mirror. And they showed him a photograph of himself once, being that he didn't know what he looks like. So he just, without any airs about it, said, it's the face of a holy man. And later they told him it was him. So that's a particular type of situation. I have looked in the mirror once or twice in my life, or more than that. And there's that famous mirror story I should mention. They say in the Middle Ages there was this great rabbi who had a student who was an excellent student, but later he made some money, which in itself is not a problem. But then the money clouded his, let's put it this way, his self-perception, and he became very selfish and very miserly. And his rabbi, his teacher, who didn't see him for many years, came to see him later on, and he saw that he had in his home a collection of many mirrors. That was one of his fads, I guess. He collected mirrors, maybe different ways to see himself through the day. And his rabbi said to him, tell me, what's the difference between a mirror and a window? A pane of glass. They're both made out of glass, the same glass. What is the difference between a mirror and a pane of glass? So he said to the rabbi, he thought the rabbi was being just naive, or just trying to find out some information. So he said, well, the difference is that they figured out, probably by accident, that when you smear silver on the back of a pane of glass, it turns into a mirror. It's the same piece of glass. The silver turns it into something that reflects your image back to you. So basically the rabbi said to him, so in other words, the difference is that without the silver, you look through the glass, you see other people. And as soon as you smear some silver on the back of the glass, all you see is yourself. Well, this man was not stupid, so he understood the message. That often money, wealth, prosperity, success can create distortions. Distortions of self-perception, to the point where, yes, you start seeing life differently. And people have changed. You know, some say people don't change, whether they have money or they don't have money. It's not necessarily true. Maybe fundamentally people don't change, deep down. But as we all know, we can be one thing inside and another thing on the outside. I say it only as some form of introduction, because I was saying about seeing faces, that the true greatest blessing and gift is to find people in your life who don't look at you just for your eyeglasses or for your general clothing and your style and your look. Not saying the look is insignificant, but it has become basically something we worship. And more importantly, if it was just looked at in context, but we equally also valued what's inside, okay, so then there's a balance. But if one is at the expense of the other, we have the distortions, what we have today, crisis of relationships. I remember I was on a cruise, it was called a rabbi, they call it a scholar in residence. I don't know what's called when you're on a cruise. I guess a scholar in Cruz, but and there was a floating scholar. Okay, yeah, still floating. So on the cruise, you've got nowhere to go except the shows on the boat, you know. So I decided to walk into one of the comedy skits that was going on. There was a comedian, a Chinese comedian, making fun of Americans. I remember two things that he said that struck me. He said one thing was he was talking about how America is such a beautiful country but so strange. You know, so the first thing was about credit. I remember that one. What did he say? He said, oh, it's very appropriate actually to our economy. This was quite a few years ago. But he said, so only in America, made in America. Only in America do you find you can be $100,000 in debt and you get a phone call. You want to get out of debt? Sure. Take a loan. He says, that's only in America. And the second thing he said, which is why I'm mentioning is relevant to our discussion here, he says, you go on a date with a woman, or it could be a man, doesn't matter which way, but in this case he said a woman, and she, you could see her face is completely recreated from her lips to her cheeks, to her throat, to her eyebrows, to everything. It's all been so-called, let's put it this way, artificially restructured, resculpted. And then, when you get to the real conversation, she says, the main thing is I want you to get to know the real me. That was his thing, the real me. So, I'm not dismissing here cosmetic surgery and the whole industry, but the point is there is definitely a dichotomy between the inner and the outer. And this is a good segue to any subject, really, that matters, but specifically the topic of this evening, leadership. You may wonder what's the connection between leadership and this. Most people define leadership as related to politics, to business leadership, to any type of directorship, someone at the helm, a captain, and what is the nature of leaders. But as you'll see, especially from a Torah Jewish perspective, leadership is far more complicated than just the technical hierarchy of executives and their subjects. It has a lot to do with relationships in general, personality, and really what makes us tick as human beings. And of course, the connection to this week, why the topic is relevant to our time right now, is, I mean, it's always relevant, but especially I'd like to link things to the chapter in the Torah that we read. And there are many reasons I do that. Is firstly, there's profound messages to be found, but more importantly, I think that the Bible is, even though it remains the biggest bestseller beyond all the charts for religious reasons, but what it's really underestimated as being is a psychological guide. And if you know how to read it and decipher its message, you'll find unbelievably timeless truths that are not forced, that are actually the natural story behind the story of the biblical events. So in this week's chapter, as you'll see, far before Karl Marx and the birth of socialism and the death of despotism and the birth of democracy, you'll see the themes of leadership and the relationship of a leader and people. And what is the role and responsibility to each other is a theme, central theme of this week's chapter. And I'll weave it into the discussion so it'll all be relevant. And above all, as you know, as I always focus on, is what is the meaning to all of us personally. It's one thing to have a philosophical, academic discussion on any given topic, including leadership, and it's another is to personalize it, that we can go away, because after everything is said and done, we have our struggles in our personal lives. So yes, we all like to be pundits, and we're all commentators today, and especially with the power of the internet. But the personalization is really the bottom line, which is, what does it mean to my life? And I've been trained and taught by my mentor, my teacher, my Rebbe, whose yahrzeit is tonight, his 15th year from when he passed, that a conversation between people, between yourself, should not be a waste of time. And how do you measure when something's a waste of time or not? It's very simple. Are there fruits from the conversation? Results? Is there something beneficial that came out of it? And it's a pretty easy thing to measure. For instance, and I'm not taking away from talk radio or sports radio, but you could listen to sports radio if you're a fan or you're not a fan. and for hours and hours, and then you ask yourself the question, so what difference does it make to my life? Is it going to help me love the people I love in a deeper way? Will help me deal with my psychological demons? Help me be a more refined human being, a more giving human being? But none of the above. It's essentially distraction. It could even be called escapism. So no one's against a certain measure of escapism, but if your whole life is consumed with never bearing any fruit of the labor of the time that you're spending on this earth, you have to really wonder why. It shouldn't surprise anyone why sometimes we are miserable. Because the fact of the matter is we are, to use the words of the Kabbalists, the mystics, we are forces of energy waiting to be released all the time. And when your energy is not released in this world, what happens to a kettle that is steaming, boiled water, and there's no spout, no release? It explodes, or it implodes. So think of yourself as a resource, as a wealthy resource filled with energy, filled with potential, and a potential waiting to be expressed, to actualize in this world. And when it's not actualized, what happens is it begins to eat away at you inside and begins to create distortions, because the human spirit cannot tolerate lack of expression. It would be like, imagine someone tying you up and putting you in a sack where you can't use your arms and legs freely. Just simply, naturally, human beings are mobile. And as mobile creatures, I'm talking simply on a physical level, we cannot tolerate that type of confinement. Now, that's just on a physical level. Imagine how much more so on a psychological, emotional level. So one of the ways to describe, as I said, the mystics describe life, is how much of your potential will you actualize in this lifetime of yours. And there is a ratio. Though we don't know how much potential we have, but there are people with trained eyes that can sometimes see. And the bottom line is, remember, your actual is always less than your potential. The question is how much less. And direct proportion to how much less, direct proportion to that ratio will be your level of inner fulfillment and happiness. In other words, happiness, in the terms of the mystics, is not about acquiring things. It's not about momentary, instant gratification. It's ultimately about how much of your inner has been expressed into the outer. How much of your potential has been actualized in this world. And each of our potential is unique. Yours is not mine, mine is not yours. Every person on this earth has a particular type of energy that they release. If you wish, you can call it a special song, your music, and it's only your music, and only you can play it. We can help each other, we can complement each other, but it's ultimately your song, your musical note that you have to actualize. And in that context, so we talk about issues of any activity that we do, including the time we spend here this evening. What's called a waste of time would be if we just sit here, and even if I entertain you and keep you laughing or inspired or whatever it may be, that's nice, better than doing something destructive, but it's not good enough, frankly. What's really the goal has to be is that there are fruits born out of this. Just like a tree bears fruits, and fruits mean perpetual, a perpetual impact. Inspiration lasts as long as it lasts, and then it dissipates. The key thing is empowerment, where we come away empowered with an ability, with newfound tool, or a new awareness, or a new hope, for that matter, that allows you to deal with your particular challenges, and in the context of trying to cut away some of the weeds, some of the distractions, and allow your flower, your music to emerge. So talking about leadership is not just a hypothetical, abstract concept. It should also, and above all, be applied to our lives, which is really the meaning of Torah in its essence, is Hera. It means from direction, from guidance. So let's begin with the academic, so to speak, or the philosophical, and move toward the personal. But it's important to put things in context. So everyone, or I mean, most of us are familiar with the classic arguments and classic schools of thought regarding the issue of a leader and leadership. And just to put it in historical perspective, history as a witness, up till 2-3 centuries ago, essentially the model of government and the model of control and power was the following. It was usually an individual or a few individuals that controlled authority almost to the point of absolute control. This may have been monarchs, despots. It may have been religious authorities, the church, or whoever came to come into power. So sometimes we had benevolent leaders, which if their whim was such with their benevolent, that would have been lucky. Or we had the opposite, savages, who used their power to destroy and to wreak havoc. You could say till the winds, what we call of enlightenment or following the Renaissance, the beginnings of what we call modern age, the birth of democracy. So many people define that moment, the French and especially the American Revolution. Up to that point, leadership was as I just described it. Obviously, there were different models. The tribal leaders in Africa, for instance, may have been different than the European monarchs. The Oriental or the Far Eastern leaders perhaps ruled in different ways. But essentially, leadership was of the few, and the masses were their subjects. And in most cases, completely at the mercy of the leader and the laws that the leader implemented. And how did these leaders control? They controlled by, obviously, wealth, power, armies, controlling that. And they controlled also through subjugation, psychological subjugation. You know, growing up in a society like that, where there weren't any options, it wasn't like you could choose, okay, I'll either live in a democracy or I'll live in a totalitarian regime. There wasn't such choices. So people psychologically were attuned to this approach. Leaders often inherited. Sometimes they won it through war, sometimes through execution, and all the methods. I'm not going to go through every particular scenario. You get the idea, because it's not really a history class, but it's important just to put things into context. Now, the justification for this model wasn't even necessary. Today, we discuss it in terms of justifying it, because now we know there are other models. And we also know that people today, the masses, have gotten power. A nation of the people, for the people, what we call a free society. So today we talk about it in that context. But then there was no other option, so it wasn't like it had to be justified. But one of the ways that these leaders maintained their so-called aura of invincibility was that they were chosen by God. In many instances, the way people saw it was that leaders, kings, or church leaders, or others were divinely ordained. They were more special. These were God's special chosen children, who God put as the leaders of this world. And this was the way it was presented. Proof, no proof. Even if someone may have been skeptical, they couldn't do much. And that's the way, more or less, history was run for many, many millennia. It probably goes back from the beginning of civilization, one form or another. As I said, in the last few centuries, things began to change. There have been studies made of what were the causes of these changes. Interestingly, I read recently, I never even thought of it, but just to show you how complicated things are. You know, most people say change is very simple. This is what we're taught in the liberal arts schools, that change is simply inevitable. People got smarter. As they got smarter, they simply they threw off the shackles of the old approach. But that would basically suggest, like 300 years ago, people suddenly were more brilliant than people 600 years ago. So not really so logical. Like, when did the brains actually enter? So what are the factors that really emerged that created a so-called different model? So one of the factors, and this is only one among many, and I'm sure there's so many that really, if you really want to look at it, it's hard to really quantify. Yeah, you can write a paper and a dissertation on it, but I would argue that there are too many factors really to come to us anything conclusive. It's a convergence of many forces at work. But one of them, just I want to mention just as an aside, because it struck me that no one would have thought of it, was connected to the plague. The Dark Plague. We know in the Dark Ages, they called it the Dark Plague. There was a plague that killed close to a third of Europe, or even more, maybe 35, 40%. It was a plague that affected every community. There was no home that did not have a death. And you think this was like one of the biggest disasters in history, and it was. Absolutely. Don't worry, Jews suffered greatly because of it. This was a great excuse for Christians to blame for poisoning the wells, and all the different other blood libels and pogroms that resulted from it. But the bottom line is, a large part of the population simply died in this plague. One of the results of it was the following. The workforce dramatically changed after that. Remember, the plague did not discriminate between monarchs and the masses. It was in direct proportion to the populations. So you can imagine the largest segment of the population that suffered were the masses, were the workforce, were the subjects, not the leaders. Leaders died too, but they were just less of them. So once this workforce was depleted, suddenly what happens in the laws of economics, even if you don't know any well, there are no laws of economics as we've learned, but the laws of supply and demand are very simple. Much less workforce means that the few that do remain are more power. So the workers that were remaining, which means, let's say, the 60%, 40% decimated and 60% remain, said, you want us to work, you need us, pay us more money. And suddenly wages went up. There was no choice. The people who owned the landowners and leaders and monarchs and the entire hierarchy were suddenly forced, simply by the laws of supply and demand, to pay higher wages. And as the higher wages went up, empowerment, a sense of control, a sense of confidence, and ability to blackmail those that were paying them. And this was a direct impact on the birth of capitalism and the birth of what we call today's economy. They said, who would have thought of it, but just to show you the forces that are at work. Maybe you're all familiar with it. Maybe I was the one that's just the only ignorant one on this planet. But I'm assuming you know that joke, the guy's driving home from work, and he suddenly gets a cell phone call from his wife. She says, honey, you're on the road, on the highway. Which highway are you on? Yeah. He's on this and this highway. She says, be careful. There's a guy driving on the wrong way in the highway. So he says to her, there's not one guy. Everybody's driving the wrong way. He was the guy, obviously, driving that way. So, he was looking out the window. Everybody's driving the wrong way. So you never know. You sometimes think you're the only one that doesn't know something. Or that nobody knows anything. You find that everybody knew, and you're the only one that was kept in the dark. Who knows? The emperor with no clothes. Lisa, where do you stand in this regard? That I understand. Which way are you driving? Which way are you driving? Are you a conformist? That's what I mean. Okay. So, with all this being said, things changed. And as the leaders were challenged about their absolute authority and their divine ordination, so to speak, we have what we call the birth of a new system. A system where people, the masses, the majorities, began to come into power. Now I have to add, just to be thorough, that there are those that argue that nothing really changed. It's the still same monarchs in power. It's just an illusion of giving individuals power. So I'm not going to address that, but there are such conspiracy theories too, right? Some say, Howard, you're one of those guys in power that's writing this puppet show script. Is that possible? You'll never admit it, will you? But regardless, conventional wisdom is, not that we give much credence to conventional wisdom, is that there has been dramatic change. And with it was unleashed a new force called individuality, the power of individuals. It's interesting, this wasn't even aspired to virtue to be an individual 1,000 years ago. I remember at the turn of the millennium, the New York Times ran this special issue called the Me Millennium, identifying the main achievements and milestones of the second millennium, basically from the year 1000 to the year 2000. And one of the things they pointed out was that group mentality was natural. Individuality was not seen as a virtue. It was seen actually as a liability. And this affected everything. This affected communes, how people lived. Private housing was not something that people looked for. Today, it's unheard of. If you have to live with someone else, it's like you'd only do that if in the worst scenario. Now this, of course, is connected to the agrarian society, where people's living and livelihood came from their own fields. So they worked and lived around farms, and there was a certain closeness to that. But nevertheless, you start wondering, what did they do with their individuality 1,000 years ago? Did they all suppress it? Was it not spoken? Again, it's hard to imagine that suddenly today we discovered individuality. It was simply unknown. As you'll see, it was very well known, but the way it's depicted is that definitely individuality was born in our time, in our modern time, that is. And therefore, the whole model of leaders versus followers, or leaders versus subjects, changed. No longer was it one or two people or a controlled entity that was controlling the rest. They became called freely elected. Elections and competition. And no one's in power just because they inherited it or because they have money. Yes, it's a system, and every system can be manipulated and can be corrupted. But as Churchill said, democracy is the worst system, but he's never found a better one. So you read Marx, and that is not Groucho, but Karl, and you find a very scathing counter-attack on capitalism and its close cousin, democracy. And the attack essentially has many, many powerful arguments to it that are very difficult to dispute. So that's why it was so appealing and seductive to many intellectuals. It's hard to imagine now that Marxism should have been so seductive, but it was. Because remember, it wasn't tested yet. So hypothetically, on paper, it sounded very, very utopian. And essentially, and again, I don't want to be oversimplistic. I refreshed myself on my Marx reading. Essentially, I'm talking now the best of his arguments, is an attack on the entire concept of capitalism being the force driven by greed, driven by self-interest, that ultimately will undo human relationships. And Marx, who wrote in German, used terms like what we call today alienation. If you're familiar with German or even Yiddish, you could see words that he used that described the results of a capitalist system, where it's true, there's a free economy, a free market, but there's also a class system. And because of private property, ultimately those that acquire more wealth will subjugate those that have less wealth. So though it's not like the monarchs of old, where it's type of absolute authority and power, but through money they wield almost the same amount of power. Because if you're dependent on your employer, it doesn't matter whether he's asking you to worship to him like the kings of old. The bottom line, you worship him because you need your paycheck. And it's money that will become the enslaver of the human race. So yes, there's progress in the sense that people today have more access and it's not controlled by a few monarchs. But in his attack on capitalist system, basically came down to the fact that people are selfish, and that selfishness will not allow equality. So he proposed the ultimate socialist system of equality, where everybody gets as much as they need, everybody works as much as they're able to, and there'd be some type of utopian sharing of the wealth, with no one individual having more than others, and therefore not creating the jealousies involved, the competition, and all the alienations he describes. And many of them, as I said, if you read them purely as a philosophy, it is quite brilliant in many ways in the insights in human nature. And more importantly, it's important to note that a lot of the capitalism as we know it today has been influenced by Marxism. We would not have labor unions. We wouldn't have many of the so-called rules and laws that regulate, for good or for bad, if it weren't for those socialist arguments. Because without those arguments, you could have, if you talk about pure capitalism, can be extremely uneven and unbalanced. Some say that right now capitalism is under such attack because you see, yes, it was able to keep together to a certain point, but then when regulation disappeared, and the ones who were supposed to watching the others themselves need to be watched, what checks and balances do we have? And this is all connected to leadership because it's all about who has the power and how that power is shared. And there's no question that selfishness and greed is a human component. You can't dismiss it. You can't just say, okay, we'll trust the stewards because they happen to be, nice people. Who do you trust? Who don't you trust? What would people do if nobody was watching? How many people would truly be ethical? So in a way, psychologically speaking, we still have the same situation of millennia ago. That people in power are going to try to be in absolute power. And they may get corrupt in the process. And absolute power, absolute corruption. So we're in the same dilemmas. Only the difference is that today there's no question that more people are involved in the discussion. And there are free elections. Yet at the same time, we face the same human forces are still at work. I know I'm loading up a lot of questions, but hopefully we're going to get to some point of some answers too. But this is all part of the discussion of leadership. Now, there's another point that must be mentioned, which drove the founding fathers, and you read in their writings, the arguments that went for King George and the so-called old establishment versus the new democracies. And the argument went, and this has to do very much with human nature. As repulsive as it may sound, the answer is the famous rhyme, which I won't repeat here as a rabbi, but that the masses are, you know what, and therefore they don't have the ability to really, manage their own affairs. In other words, the argument going that they're only individuals, the minority, that have the power to lead. Most people, as the way these philosophers put it, are involved in the little interests of their little life. They're going to go to work, come home, their families, their immediate concerns, pedestrian concerns of life. And are not interested in the vision and the big picture of leadership, balancing different interests, and all the other factors that are required for running a healthy government. Now, even Aristotle, going back to then, discusses this topic as well, which is why there were the arguments of the different type of kings, philosopher kings, and others that were benevolent leaders, because the masses simply are not equipped and are not interested. If you ask most people, you want to be a leader in your city, your town? No. If you tell them, I'll make a lot of money by being leader and I have to do much, I could sleep all day, of course everyone will say yes. But that type of ambition, that type of brute, aggressive nature that you may need to have, and that is not what most people necessarily want. People want to just have a peaceful, simple life. So if that's true, and this is not my thought, this is written by most thinkers actually would say, this is a fact of life statistically. So by nature, whether we like it or not, there's some people who are just more cut out to be leaders than others. Now, if you think this is some primitive thought, it affects us till this day, because as a matter of fact, the reason there's an electoral college in the United States, even though nobody really knows what it does or what it's supposed to do, but the basis of it was this argument. The argument was, if you make free elections, which sounds so noble, we have one simple problem. Most people don't even know who to vote for. Whoever gives them an ice cream that day, whoever throws them something that way, they'll vote for them. What's the problem? You can manipulate elections. Well, you got to go into a town and cater to the people, pander to them, and you'll get their vote. Most people don't know who to elect. How do they? They're not intelligent enough or not wise enough. And this was said in the halls of Congress when this country was founded. So you're going to give the masses the power to vote. They can elect Mickey Mouse. He didn't exist then, but you get the idea. And he does get more ballots, by the way, than many real human beings. So, on the other hand, what do? The whole idea of our democracy is to giving people the rights. So what are you going to choose a few individuals who are going to elect? So they came up with the electoral college, which is some type of representation that people are electing actually electors. In other words, you're really voting for someone on your block that you trust has more wisdom than you to vote for a leader. And officially, he can vote for someone you voted for or not voted for, because you're trusting him. Whether this is, I don't know if it ever worked or didn't work. I don't know the whole history of the electoral college. But you still have a reality that one candidate can win the majority of the popular vote and still lose the election. Because the electors are defined by the states. Each state has its amount of electors, per million, et cetera, like the House of Representatives. Bottom line is, I just want to point out that till this day, the debate continues to rage about whether there's really such a thing as equality in choosing, even choosing leaders. So there's no question it's not comparable in a very blatant way to the monarchs of old or to that type of absolute power, but still we're faced with a real dilemma here. Are most people really capable of even defining what a leader is? Okay, so let's go to the other extreme. Who needs leaders altogether? Who created this illusion we need leaders? Leaders say we need leaders. But the rest of us, do we agree or don't we agree? So, of course, the argument against no leadership at all is simply chaos. Who is going to balance and how will you balance different self-interests? Even Marx, in his utopian vision, which we shall address, never worked out anyway, but even in theory, didn't argue that suddenly everybody's suddenly going to become this type of equality and everyone will just respect each other. He also had the dilemma. You have people who own private property. How will this world turn into a communist universe when there's some that have more than others? So there's the debates, the Lenin version, the Stalin version, the different communists that wrote their theories on Marx. And the consensus, at least by some of them, was that there would need to be a so-called transition period, where there'd be a few individuals, this is the catch here, that would be trusted with passing over and passing on private property into the public domain until the entire world goes through a communist revolution. And it was contingent that the whole world goes through the revolution, because as long as there's one person on earth that still has a private country house, it's going to create jealousy among others. So everyone has to embrace the communist vision, which is, by the way, the basis of 1984, Orwell's. This approach. You can't have one person different. Everyone has to agree, or else it undermines the whole purpose, the whole objective. And then utopia. There's one little catch is that nobody really addressed, and nobody knew how to address. Who are these stewards? Who are you going to trust with this transition? So we trusted, they trusted the Bolsheviks, Lenin, and then, of course, it turned into Stalin. And the biggest abuse of individual power in history, ironically, came from the people who were claiming to be the ones that want to turn the world into a place where there's no individual power. All the monarchs of old didn't kill as many people as Stalin did. Just to show you what happens, you could have a great theory, but the bottom line is one person comes into power, and in the name of the so-called the ends justify the means, that you can do anything. You can kill millions, like the guy who said, blood will spill in the streets, but there's going to be peace, one way or another. No? He ends up killing everybody because he wants peace, in the name of peace. So, to go back to the central theme here, what do you do? To sum it up, when you're living in a world with people of diverse opinions and diverse personalities, to simplify, we have 6 billion people, but let's say we had a world of 10 people. 10 people doesn't mean they're going to get along. So these 10 people, just for a moment, because remember, 6 billion is ultimately just 10 multiplied that many times. So these 10 people can't get along, so they decide, listen, for us to coexist, we're intelligent people, we don't want to kill each other. You have interests, I have interests, we shall sit down, negotiate. We'll appoint one of our 10 who's going to be the leader. What does leader mean? So you write the rules for leaders, you negotiate that too. Now that's a scenario of a democratic environment. Is it perfect? No, but it's better than just being at each other's throats with no rules and no red lights and no green lights. Let's make at least red lights and green lights. Some people will run a red light, yeah. So we try to enforce that. So we have certain rules, and we have some people who are enforcers, but we give them the power. In a so-called totalitarian scenario that I mentioned earlier, it doesn't work that way. It works that way is that this group of 10, one person who has the arms or the money simply muscles everyone and says, look, I got the power, take it or leave it. I'll kill you if you don't accept it, or leave. That would be the totalitarian power model. But in a democratic one, you have a certain type of discussion, and you come to some terms, as I said, far from perfect, but it works. If you didn't come to any discussion, the 10 people would end up killing each other, one way or another. So there's the justification for, we call it leadership. We call it somebody who's spending his time being paid by the other 9, or by the group of 10, to serve as the mayor, as the governor, as the leader, as the president, whatever the name you give him, with limited powers, and let's say every 4 years you re-elect this person. So this is a sensible option, definitely preferable than the other one, the totalitarian one, where you're completely subject, you're essentially a slave, complete slave. Now, what happens? Here's the problem. What happens, this group of 10, this leader, slowly, with power, yes, initially it was all with goodwill and good intentions, decides to use his power beyond what he was given. Since he's in the position, the other 9 are busy at work, they're busy doing their things, this guy decides to do some things that cuts the corners, profits from it, gets a little corrupt, tries to eliminate one of the others that opposes him, tries to neutralize them. You know, the conventional thing that happens in boardrooms where people start the manipulation and so on. So here too, if you're intelligent people, you have to build in a certain cushion for that, knowing that's possible. And there too, there's some type of checks and balances, whether it's re-elections, whether it's oversight. I mean, the different approaches. Is it airtight? No. I'm just giving, again, the scenarios of simple, I'm putting it maybe oversimplistic, but if you really magnify, this is essentially the different models of leadership. Is it, as I said, foolproof? Absolutely not, because every person can get very corrupt and can do a lot of destructive things. A person can begin with good intentions even, and not even know it, but suddenly he's in a position where he thinks he's smarter, arrogance and other forces at work, and things change. So, of course, there's the rebellion against any type of corruption or any type of totalitarian attitude, which is eliminate the pedestals of power, which is a temptation. And even in the 60s and other times, you can say the more radical movements argued that, because they said, look at our leaders. What kind of leaders do we have? They're not role models. They're not ethical people. They're not spiritual. So Timothy Leary came up with the idea to put LSD in the water supply of Washington. He said that will solve all the world's problems. You know, with what you're seeing today, maybe he was right. Who knows? I don't know if it would have solved their problems, but definitely would have kept everybody pretty much in bliss and distracted. So I don't know, maybe that itself is a solution. What do you think about that? I'm not proposing that, and please, for the record, that's not my suggestion. And I don't even know how you'd manage that, but it's an interesting concept. Obviously, his counterpart, who disagreed adamantly with him, Aldous Huxley, who was an elitist, said LSD is only for the elite. You can't give it to the Washingtonians. They won't know what to do with it. You know. But that's another argument about elitism. So when you apply this to the world today, you could see different scenarios. You see in the Middle East, in Iran, especially now, the struggle, which was not very similar to struggles that happened 200-300 years ago in religious countries in the West, which was the power of the church versus the power of the politicians. And Islam is just a few hundred years behind Christianity, but you can pretty much predict the same trajectory because there's similar forces at work. The absolute power of religion, God-given power, versus a people that perhaps want their own rights. Not to say those rights are necessarily healthier, but the conflicts of individuality versus authority. And the Middle East is going to go through its own growing pains. You know, I mean, it's a mild word to use. It can be a lot more, unfortunately, tragic than that, but God will help. The question really is how we look at all of this. And this brings me to the story of Korach and the story of leaders. And another reason I wanted to speak about it tonight was because it's a topic that I personally is close to my heart. And it's something that people bring up to me quite often, more often than I would like. But it's inevitable. Being that I had the honor and privilege to work many years for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose 15th yahrzeit is tonight, the 3rd of Tammuz, and I had worked closely in the sense where my job was to document, which was more complicated than that. We had to actually recreate. On Shabbat and holidays, no tape recorders or notes were used. So when the Rebbe would speak, as a great scholar he was, and there are no tapes and notes, what do you do? Any ideas? You use your brain, which means you listen, and your mind has to memorize and retain it. Familiar concept? With all our gadgets, I know it's not so simple. You know, but we had nothing else to rely upon, and that's what we did. So sometimes for 6-7 hours of these dense conversations about life and about philosophy and about Kabbalah and about Talmud and about politics and about everything about the human condition, my job, the small group of people, I was the main writer and the main retainer, was to recreate these teachings and then document them, commit them to paper, research them, annotate them, and publish them. So it was a great honor for me, and it was also a privilege, and even beyond that, actually quite transformative. If you do that for a good 14, 15 years of your life, it's quite changes who you are. Changes your ability to the way you see yourself, the way your mind works, and so on. And I would definitely, if I had any say in the boards of education of this country, insist that students should be at least sometimes subject to this responsibility to have to retain with their natural minds information. I'm talking about important information. You can't imagine what it does to you that you have to do that, because it forces you to own ideas, not just to listen to them. To own ideas is a whole different story than to listen. To own means absorbing, processing, to the point where you can assimilate it into your system and it never leaves you. Many times you hear ideas that are even brilliant, but you see the next day you can't really repeat them because you haven't absorbed it. You've heard it. Your ears travel faster than your brain. So your ears heard someone else make sense. But to absorb it, to own it, to make it something that you can apply in your life, into your life, teach to others, share with others, that requires a whole other level of integration, internalization. That was part of what I did. Well, I would say part, that was a big part of it. So of course I'm asked the question, especially after I wrote the book Tour to Meaningful Life, and I went out on the book tour. William Morrow, the publisher, sent me. It was a big book tour across the country. It was then 1995. It was a year after the Rebbe's passing. And one of the biggest questions I was asked, among many others, being that I met people who had not met a person that looks like me, and definitely not someone who speaks the language of psychology and relevant to the secular world, which Tour to Meaningful Life presents in a universal way these ideas. So I was challenged. They said, okay, this book is very good, very interesting. But the Orthodox world that you look like you come from, I say that because it's not where I come from in my terms, it doesn't seem open to any larger world. And the Rebbe is the classic stereotype of a cult leader, of a demagogue. So I was faced with this question many, many times about, is a Rebbe infallible? What is a Moses and what is a true Jewish leader? And the way the Rebbe, many people will perceive, was listened to in absolute terms, never questioned. It gives a certain sense of deifying of a human being. And at the same time, we all know that in Judaism, we don't deify human beings. There's only one God. I remember I was on a plane once and sitting near a Methodist minister. And we were talking, it was one of those conversations. And I asked him, I'm middle in passing, about the Pope, who was then in New Jersey, New York. So he said to me, well, you know, we're Protestants, we don't really believe in the Pope and his so-called, and all the sacraments, and then the Pope being some reincarnation of Jesus. And then he says it so nonchalantly, he gives me this line, he says, you know, we don't believe in intermediaries. We pray to Jesus directly. And I remember sitting there, and like I said, so I didn't want to argue with him, contradiction of terms, so I said to him, yeah, I went to yeshiva with this guy. So he said, what? What do you mean? I said, I went to yeshiva with Jesus. We studied the same Talmud, the same Shulchan Aruch, the same learning. And why did you choose him as a God, not anyone else in the class? So he was an intelligent guy, so he got what I was saying. But the intermediary. So Jews don't believe in intermediaries. So then the question, of course, is about what is a Rebbe? What is, if that we'll go further, look at Moses in the Torah, man of God. That's what he's called, a man of God. So Korach had exactly this problem in this week's chapter. He had a problem with a Rebbe. He had a problem with a real leader of that caliber. Because we're not just talking about a political leader who's elected for 4 years to administrate, to put out fires, etc. You're talking about a leader that has certain authority that can affect people's lives in real ways, life and death. So Korach, who happened to be Moses' cousin, and happened to be a brilliant man, it says Pikachaya, he was wise, sharp, and he happened to also be very wealthy, just for the record. It's relevant to the story. It adds to the chutzpah, so to speak. So he confronts Moses. And this is long before Marx, and long before democracy, and long before all those that challenge monarchs. Listen to the words of the Bible and tell me how progressive this is. It's thousands of years ago, a man like Korach, he says the following. I'm just translating from the original Hebrew without commentary. So he gathered a group of people to rebel, a mutiny against Moses, against the leader. And he says, this is what Korach's words. He says to them, the entire nation, Kala Eda Kulam Gedeshim, the entire nation are sacred people, are holy people. And God is among them, but B'taychem Hashem. Umadua tisnasu al kahal Hashem. Why did you lift yourselves, raise yourselves higher and superior to the rest of the nation, to the rest of the divine nation? A very legitimate argument. Korach, as I said, was very wise. He wasn't just making an argument. The whole Bible is based on a very fundamental principle, which leads me to the whole issue I was describing with individuality and leadership. The principle is very simple. And long before the founding fathers wrote in the Declaration of Independence, the statement goes, all people are created equal. They said all men, but the Torah is all people are created equal. In the words of the Bible itself, right in the beginning in Genesis, every human being, meaning starting from Adam and Eve, and as a result, by virtue of your creation, of your birth, everyone here in this room, everyone on this planet, 6 billion people and counting, without exception, were created in the divine image. And there's even a Mishnah in the Pirkei Avot that testifies, Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tzelem. Beloved is the human being created in the image of the divine. So however you interpret Tzelem Elokim, Tzelem, image of God, obviously is not anthropomorphic, it's something spiritual, and there are many different explanations, but clearly it's a equalizer, that every human being has it. And nowhere, anywhere in the Torah will you find that one person has it more than another. And you may say, everyone? What about a criminal? Even a murderer, the Torah says, has it. To the extent that even in the Torah there is capital punishment under certain conditions, rare, but under certain conditions. And the Torah, of course, as a legal document, also documents that even if you have to, God forbid, hang or execute someone because they murdered, or whatever they did that was a terrible crime, or not to allow them to hurt others, even then you have to respect their divine image, and you're not allowed to desecrate or in any way shame that body. I'm just using, I know it's a little extreme, but just to point out how this is an unequivocal statement with no exception. So, going with that premise, that every human being is a divine entity, and no one is more than another, Korach's argument is extremely strong. He's saying to Moses and Aaron, his brother, you're the leader, Aaron's the high priest, the entire nation are holy, and God is among them. And he quotes even B'teicham, you could say, relates to the word earlier in the Torah. It says V'shechanti b'seicham. That God says, build for me a temple, and I will rest among you. Among you. It doesn't say in it, in the building. And it says among you doesn't mean among Moses and Aaron. Among you, among the entire nation. And Korach quotes that of B'teicham Hashem, God is among them. So why did you, Madua Tisnasu? In 2 words, Korach said, what every rebel against power has said out in history. Why did you raise yourself higher? Who are you to be greater than the rest of the nation? This is Korach. And obviously he's going to end up being wrong, not only wrong, terribly wrong, but his argument is tremendous. Another thing that's important to point out, the Torah is not afraid of this argument. If you're talking about a book, you read a lot of spiritual books, you're not going to usually find a spiritual book written by a spiritual master where the spiritual master is telling you how people rebelled against him with very good arguments. If anything, he's going to couch them in very weak arguments, self-serving. Here you have a document, which, as you'll see, the story turns out that Korach was wrong. And there are reasons for it. We'll discuss why. But you'd think, if he was wrong, why do we have to document in the first place? Why do you have to bring up such a story where there was such a mutiny and a rebellion, and give it such credence? And it's a very strong argument. It's not like it doesn't say in the Torah, Korach was arrogant. He says, why are you in power? Let me be in power. There are commentaries that explain that was part of his agenda. But the point being, in the Torah itself, it says, very powerful, all people are holy. Why do you lift yourself? Why do you exalt yourself? And this argument remains till this day. So clearly it's also part of the Torah to know this argument and to know this challenge. So whenever anyone asks me about the Rebbe, so even though, as I said, I would have preferred to talk about other things, but in truth I remind myself of this story, and I said, If Korach could ask it, they could ask it. And obviously, I'm not like Moses, so the more chutzpah to ask me than Korach had to ask Moses. And I realized that, on the contrary, a true spiritual journey includes the questions we ask. It includes the skepticism we have. And if you're not allowed to ask and challenge a leader, as Korach did, then there's a question on the openness here. If it's truth, it says, Moshe emes v'Torah emes. That's the end of the story. Moses is true, and the Torah is true. But truth has to be able to be tested. You can't just say, as I said, a totalitarian regime, whoever's in power says that's the truth and that's it. No a second party, there's no option. You know. What do they say, the joke about Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union after Stalin. So there was a reporter in Moscow who wrote an article that Khrushchev is crazy. And so they arrested him, and they gave him 2 life sentences. The first life sentence is for embarrassing the head of state. And the second life sentence was for revealing a state secret. You know? This is Soviet Union at its best. So the point is that the key is to be able to challenge a leader. Obviously, with respect, Korach had his ways of doing that, maybe was not appropriate. But the concept, the Torah would not document it if the question has no validity at all. The question has validity, and we have to discuss it. But here is the first most important point of all, which I began with. In all the models of leadership that I described earlier, whether democracy, whether monarchs, whether the benevolent monarchies, with all the arguments back and forth that people can rule themselves, can't rule themselves, and how you balance it and all of that, there's one key thing missing in all those discussions. And the only one that actually corrected it was the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence. But Judaism, this is its driving engine. Before we talk about leaders, and before we talk about models of government, and models of interaction, and how do many people, that group of 10 people I was describing, how they work together, despite their self-interest and the conflicts they may have. The most important thing is our first point of departure. What is our first assumption? Even Aristotle, when you read the Republic and other books that he wrote, the first assumption is in Judaism is fascinating and fundamental. The first assumption is, why are we here in the first place? What are human beings here for? And the first assumption in the Bible is that you are a sacred entity. The words of Korach, a sacred entity, created in the divine image with a mission to fulfill. And everything else is commentary. Everything else is built to help support that. This is vital. And I'll explain why. Usually you talk about religion, for instance. No one will begin with that premise usually. Religion, you'll say, is like this. At best, I'm not talking about critics of religion. Even advocates will say religion, yes, religion requires certain group mentality, certain conformity, but it's good for the benefit for the group. We sometimes have to put aside our Yetzer Hara, our evil inclination, our self-interests. So we do the same mitzvahs and we pray together because there's certain benefits in this group mentality. Does it require conformity? Often. In other words, we have to give up some of our individuality for the greater cause, so to speak. No one is going to begin and say that religion is the ultimate expression of individuality. You haven't heard that very often. I'm here to tell you exactly that. That the first basis of the entire Judaism and Torah, as I understand it, not the way you maybe heard about it in so-called religious schools, is the first verses in Genesis. Who is a human being? Before we begin with everything, who is the human being? Who are you and who am I? So if we are here, let's say someone says, oh, you're a person that has a lot of selfish interests. You have temptations, seductions, and so on. So you need to be put into line. So we're giving you a religion to keep you in line. That's not the Torah's assumption. The Torah begins, a human being doesn't even say a human being is an intelligent creature, an emotional creature. A human being is a divine entity sent to this earth for a mission to fulfill a divine purpose. And your purpose is indispensable. No one can do what you have to do, period. Once you have that premise, everything else changes. So then the Torah and its mitzvahs and leaders and systems all come to support that individuality. The heart and soul of Jewish thought in its pure form is the expression of the individual's potential, as I began this class. Actualizing the potential that you carry inside your soul on this earth, in refining the universe, elevating it, and turning it into a divine entity, a divine abode. Now, here's the question now. Okay, if you were the only person on earth, fine, that's what you go ahead doing. You may have distractions. So that's your challenge, is to get beyond the temptations and distractions. But now the problem begins that we're not alone on this earth. We suddenly have the so-called symbolic 10 people that I mentioned. It's really 6 billion today, but just to keep things a little easier to understand. So now you have 9 other people on this earth who also have this mission. And you both are fighting over the same resources. And you say, listen, I'm doing what God wants. The other one is saying, I'm doing what God wants. And then begin the conflicts. Everyone thinks they're the one that's right. So you have to have some system not to undermine individuality. Remember, that's the point, that's the assumption. The divine expression of your life. We have to have some system that learns to work and interact with other so-called divine entities on this earth. So yeah, they say there's these 2 Jews left in Afghanistan. The only 2 Jews. They don't speak to each other. They're at war. Because each of them thinks he's the head of the community. Now, there is no community except these 2. But you get the idea. So, the same God that gave each of us this type of sacred mission also understood that when human beings interact with each other, they have different opinions. Different Ein Deis Ein Shavos. They don't think alike. They don't look alike. So the systems that the Torah describes and prescribes for leadership are all meant not just for people to coexist, are meant for people to enhance the individual expression of the individual. That means that a leader is here to serve the people, not the people is here to serve the leader. That's in simple terms. That's why when Moses was on the mountain, and the Jews down below built the golden calf, betraying God. So God says to Moses, Lech, raid, go down, descend below. And Rashi, the commentary from Medrash, says, raid migdulascha. What was God telling Moses? Go descend. I mean, obviously, where else can he go? The Jews are not higher than them. They're below the mountain, beneath the mountain. So the commentaries explain God was telling him a very profound message. You have to descend from your pedestal, from being here in the lofty heavens with me, the ivory tower, and go down from your gedulascha, from your greatness. Why? Because klum, the only reason I gave you greatness was for them, not for you. There in one sentence is how the Torah sees a leader. And the only person that can earn to be a leader. In other words, it's not about you, and you have a bunch of people working for you because you're in power or in control, and you're able to dominate. It's about them. We don't need leaders. Korach was absolutely right. Everybody's sacred. What Korach was wrong was in his interpretation of a leader. Korach is right if a leader thinks that he's somewhat closer to God, or because he's in control or he's smarter, or because the masses can't rule themselves and can't manage their affairs. So here I am, God's gift, and I'm going to lead and be the one that directs everyone. Then, if that's the case, Korach is absolutely right. The problem is that Korach was wrong in the definition of a leader. The reason he was wrong is because he thought he could be a leader, and he was projecting what he thinks a leader is about. He was basically saying, usually that's what you say. What do you have when people are not in power? What do they say about people in power? The people are holy and sacred. Look what Stalin used to say. He killed 30 million or more. But he said, the people, I love the people. They're so beautiful. And this one is trying to kill them. Kill him. And meanwhile, he ended up killing 30 million people because they're killing the beloved people. That's what people say when they're, you don't say, I'm great and I can do whatever I want. You say, the people, I love the people so much. So Korach who said the right words, but the question is, what was he challenging? He was challenging a leader that he, in his mind, projected would be someone who, thinks he's better, thinks he's smarter, thinks he's wealthier. What he did not know was who Moses really was. And interestingly, Moses does not say to him, hey, I'm the leader, I was elected, you can go to the Supreme Court and challenge my election, God chose me. That's not what Moses said. Moses, in his ultimate humility, accepts his challenge and goes to God and says, this is what Korach is saying, what do you suggest? And the Torah continues a whole process of testing and proving. God doesn't say, oh, you're right, Korach is wrong and that's it. There's a whole process of actually a reality check. And here we'll get to what a real leader is. Even the word itself may be deceptive. Judaism is driven by fierce individuality because each of us, each of you, as Korach put it, is absolutely a divine entity. That's a very sacred thing. A divine entity, no one has a right to control or lead a divine entity. You have everything inside of you right now to lead your life. Why would you need anybody else to listen to? And the answer is, because even though we're a divine entity, but we're also trapped in an egotistic personality and a selfish body. A true leader in Judaism is ultimately the epitome is Moses himself. How is Moses described the first time in the Torah? And firsts are very important. As I mentioned, the first time the Torah describes a human being, Tselem Elokim, B'Tzalmeinu Kidmuseinu. What about Moses? How is Moses described the first time? So the truth is, the first time he's described is, interestingly, a child was born and light came into the house. The house was filled with goodness. They looked at him, they saw goodness, and as explained, light came into the home. But when he's described personality-wise, this great leader, how is he described? Moshe Haya Roya. And Moses was a shepherd. And everyone raises their arms and asks, why? What kind of description is that? He happened to be a shepherd of Yisro, his future fathers-in-law sheep. Big thing. So what? Every time someone does something, you have to name them? Why is this like the description? Moses was a shepherd. And in the Bible, in the Torah, you want to understand things, you compare. And you look at another great leader, King David. And he too, the first time he's described, David HaYaraya, that he as a young man was a shepherd. And the Medrash explains why. Because when Moses was a young child, when Moses was a shepherd in the plains of Midian, where his father-in-law, his future father-in-law lived, Yisro. So once one sheep of the flock wandered away. This is a medrash that goes back. You'll see how a story is told. And Moses, though there were thousands of sheep, he was a good shepherd, he was a faithful shepherd. Roya Neman is the expression used. So he began searching, where's the sheep? And he looked and finally realized the sheep had wandered away from the flock because it was thirsty. And it went to find the brook of water. And it found the brook of water and sipped some water. And that's where he found the sheep, at the edge of the water, sipping, drinking. So Moses lifted the little sheep on his shoulders, carried it back to the flock. A very, you can say, almost invisible story. Had the Medrash not told us, we would never know who was watching. Yisro wouldn't know. Thousands of sheep, so one sheep disappeared. Even how many shepherds would even know that one sheep disappeared? But the Torah tells that God was watching. And the most beautiful things in life are the things that are not seen in the public eye, the things you do in private. How you treat a child when no one's watching. And what happens is that God says, if Moses will treat a sheep that way, with such sensitivity, it is he that I will entrust my people to. And that's why the Torah, for posterity and forever, says, Moshe was a shepherd. That's who he was. Tended for sheep. Shepherd cares about every sheep. Every individual sheep. It makes no difference how many there are. This sheep is unique, individual, needs a drink. He was sensitive. And he was even in pain that he wasn't sensitive, that the sheep had to run off, find its own water. These are stories that happen in our own lives, things that happened when you were a child. Someone did something nice for you. No one else will ever remember. You remember. And God forbid the other way around as well. You find a similar story when Miriam watched over Moses when he was a baby in the basket on the water. So it says because she watched over the baby for a little while, she would be watched over later in life. So it's these little gestures. And this is what captured the story of a leader. What is it in one word? One word is he did not take himself so seriously. Humility. Moshe Ya'anov, the Torah says, he was the humblest that ever walked on this earth. It's also a strange way to describe a leader. You could say Moses was the wisest, the man of Torah, the leader that confronted Pharaoh. Who else stood up to Pharaoh? Led the Jews out of Egypt. 40 years of the wilderness. It wasn't an easy job, as Ben Gurion said, to run a country that everyone's a prime minister. Moses was leading the Jews through a wilderness for 40 years, and they constantly rebelled. It was never simple. Yet, of the description, besides the shepherd, is the next one, the humblest. Why? Because the point of a leader, the true essence of a leader, has nothing to do with power, has nothing to do even with managing a government and administration. The essence of a leader is to help individuals find the water and actualize themselves. And it's only that leader that deserves to be a leader. Korach did not know that Moses was that. He would tragically find out, but it was too late then. So he challenged Moses for the legitimate. He said, people in power? Wait, what are you in power? Everyone's holy. What makes you holier? And Moses was not holy. That was not the point. Moses was humbler, however. Because precisely what I said earlier, that when you have people and everyone has self-interest, and despite the fact that we have a divine image, we have our own pettiness and so on, a true leader comes our way to do only one thing, to be an example of selflessness, to help you get beyond your pettiness so you can be an example of selflessness. That's what Moses was told by God. You're not giving greatness for you, you're giving greatness for them. I put you here so you should be able to help them become like you. A true selfless individual dedicated to your mission in life. So there's a story in the book of Samuel where the Jews come to Samuel and ask him to anoint and appoint a king. And Samuel gets very upset at the Jewish people and says, what do you need a king for? You have God. No intermediaries. You have God. But they insist. So Samuel, as anguished as he was, goes to God and says, what do I do? And God says, okay, if they want one, appoint a king. So then he appoints the first king in Israel. His name was King Saul. So the question is asked that Tzemach Tzedek, the namesake of the Rebbe, the third Chabad Rebbe, says, ask the question, what was the problem here? One of the 613 mitzvahs in the Torah, Som Tasim Alecha Melech, appoint a king, a leader. The Jews came to Samuel, they want a leader, a king. Why did Samuel get upset? What does he need to turn to God for? They want a leader, so appoint a king. That's what it says in the Torah. So Tzemach Tzedek, in a brilliant fashion, explains a very simple truth, the one I was just describing. He sensed that the people didn't want a leader for what the Torah says you should have a leader. They wanted a leader for nationalistic pride. All the nations of the world have a leader, we want a leader. Like a Queen Elizabeth type. With all due respect to her. A symbolic thing. An ego trip for the nation. The reason the Torah says have a leader is to have someone that is the humblest of all, to help you become humble and help you find your mission in this world. That's not what they want. They wanted a leader with pomp and circumstance, with the majesty, be able to say, look at our king, look at our kingdom, look at our wealth, look at our power. That's what bothered Samuel. And God said, since that's where they're at, let them have that meanwhile. The embodiment of a leader, King David was ultimately the embodiment, is the shepherd. Which means it's not about someone who we look up to and say, look at what kind of palace he sits in, or she. How many horses or ministers. How much majesty and wealth, opulence, pillage, and all that. In Judaism, in Torah, a leader is how little he has. A person of no individual interest, dedicated completely to help people find what their personal mission in life is. And that's the only reason you need a leader. Because we don't need a leader to tell us who's smarter than us. That's a teacher. So yes, of course, we begin with less knowledge. You go to school, you find a mentor, you find good teachers, amongst the not so good teachers, and you study. A leader is more than just a teacher. A leader helps empower you to find your mission in life and to be able to fulfill your sacred journey. That's what Moses was there for. He was also a teacher in the process. Part of it is teaching. But that was the bottom line, what a true leader is. He lifts the nation up to another place. And that's where leadership has a place. Now, this is all long before, as I said, capitalism and democracy and Marxism. Because there it already gets into a political realm, where there you're talking about how do you balance egos. In a way where there's some type of checks and balances. So the best we're going to get is what we have. A very faulty system that at times will completely go bankrupt, or virtually, because you can't trust anyone. Completely different world when you talk about leader in the context of Torah. It's not even in the same realm. So you could say, how can we apply these lessons of leadership to politics? You can, and I will address that in a few moments. But first, we have to just put them in stark terms, in stark contrast. So the concept of the leader in the Torah is completely something that most of us don't even expect, and probably some of you are hearing for the first time. Who talks about leadership in the same sentence as selflessness? Presidents. Yeah, some of them better than others, but everybody had to be somewhat ruthless. And I don't mean necessarily unethical. When I say ruthless, you have to have a lot of chutzpah, a lot of manipulation, because you have to climb through. Even if you're the greatest person, you have parties to deal with. You have people you have to cater to. I know sometimes in political campaigns people are painted as some type of maverick who went against all the systems. Yeah, but who got him there? He's either Democrat or Republican. He went through some system. So it's good for the image. And I'm not suggesting that all presidents are corrupt and necessarily only maneuver through systems. The fact is that we believe that if people maneuvered through it all and they're the biggest fundraiser for their party, they must have done something right. Whether that's a correct assumption or not is another story. Does everybody feel the best person, the candidate in the world is now president of the United States? Maybe now because Obama has a certain messianic complex or image, meanwhile. But the point I'm trying to make here is that the political system is structured that, that there's a lot of stuff you have to do that is very far from pure selflessness. Hopefully, once you get into office, we do have presidents that have risen to the occasion, and sometimes surprisingly so, because once you're in that position, we also believe, as Jews, as cynical as you want to be, that once a person is in a position of power, God is with them in a certain way and blesses them, and hopefully they'll use their position in a positive way, even if they didn't always begin in the most positive way. But that's another discussion. The point I'm making here is that we talk about leadership in a philosophical sense. The biggest question has to be asked, the one that Korach said. They're all holy. What are you choosing one holier than the other? The answer is we're not. You're choosing one more selfless because the rest of us are not selfless. That we know. Choosing one who has the vision. I remember walking home often late at night from the work I did, which was I'm going the wee hours. And, at night, people at night are usually the time when they have their homes and they have their families or they have their misery. But it also comes from the same root. And I would remember walking often and I would watch and I'd see the lights on in the Rebbe's room. It'd be 4 o'clock in the morning. This is after his wife passed away. Before that he would go home. But I always thought to myself, because one of the things that always stood out for me was is untiring consistency, commitment. No vacations, no breaks. Everybody's got a break. Weekend. You finish a project, the next day is a little lighter. Vacations. And here I personally witnessed no break at all. To the point that you had to keep up. It wasn't that simple. And it moved me to tears because what I saw was, and all I needed was one in my life. I myself am a cynic by nature, to be honest. And even an anarchist to a certain extent. And when I was younger, I was very skeptical. I probably still am, retain it, but I was skeptical about people, about systems and establishments. Because I saw what most of us see. Corruption, potential for corruption, who could you trust? And it wasn't, frankly, because I was abused or any way, or because somebody has abused my trust. I actually was on the other side of things. I never trusted anyone in the first place. I never was disappointed. I'm not saying that's better necessarily. But then I met many people. I had friends who were very disappointed and very disillusioned. And you go through that stage, or maybe you don't go through it, but it's a stage that sometimes you keep. And in my own journeys, I used to wonder about this. And I never met a person without an agenda. I don't think you did either, probably. Except yourself, of course. But everybody else has an agenda, right? And here I did meet someone without an agenda. With all my cynicism, and I hurled much of it, and challenges, there's certain things I saw. I was close, I could see. Things that were not, like the shepherd with Moses. You can't deny the fact he went to save a sheep. Either it happened or it didn't happen. It's not because somebody was watching, no one was videotaping it. The small things that you see in privacy, that you see when no one's watching, subtle things. You see how people treat children, where there's no real gain. In Torah, there's a concept called chesed shel emes. It means chesed is kindness, love. But kindness and love can be done for ulterior motives. People give a lot of chesed for tax deductions. Not saying necessarily only for the tax deduction, but it's an incentive. People give to be honored. Even give to feel good to give. And there's nothing wrong with that. At least someone's being helped. But then there's a chesed shalemis where you really give and there's nothing you get in return. One of the examples, I don't want to use it because it's a sad example, but I use it because it's a halachic example, a legal one, so I'll use it. When you help bury someone, a past person who doesn't have anyone to help bury him, that's a chesed shalemis, because you're not going to get a return favor, at least not in this lifetime. It's a chesed that you're doing without anyone repaying you, because that person is no longer here. There are opportunities each of us will have where you'll be asked to do something. God will send you an opportunity, and you will not get anything in return. I'm not saying most cases, but there are some. Those are very pure moments because they test who you really are, whether it's inconvenient, whether you'll also go out of your way. So I saw personally, and I say this as a witness, enough that challenged my skepticism. And all I needed was one. I said to myself, if there's one person like in every generation, from Moses, 90 generations ago, till this day, I don't care if 6 billion people on this planet are all selfish and can't be trusted. If there's one, that's all I need to know. Because it's not a quantity thing. It's a quality thing. So there was a chassid that was once asked by a cynic as well. He says, you so respect your Rebbe. Is he, who was greater, the Rebbe or Moses? And of course, Moses is no one greater than Moses. So the chassid answered innocently, for me, the Rebbe is greater. And the guy started berating him. How could you say that? Halachically, you're not allowed to say that. No one's supposed to be compared to Moses. So he said, listen to me, my friend. Because without the Rebbe, I wouldn't believe in Moses. So there's some practical things. When you see truths in your life, it's true there was a Moses that lived thousands of years ago. And we read about him. You can admire him, and sometimes you can identify. But there's nothing like seeing an experience in your life right here and saying, that happened. I relate to this story of Moses. Because then it comes alive. So that type of experience, a moment of truth, epiphany, you could say, where you see selflessness that's greater than selfishness, is extremely powerful. Many of you maybe have never encountered that yet in your life, and I'm not telling you have to take my word for it. But this is ultimately the confidence that we have in ourselves and in others and in God and in the Torah and in Moses and in the leaders that are true leaders. And that is that perhaps there is a place, one place reserved inside your own soul that has not been touched and jaded by life. A pure place. A pure place, whether it's a place like Moses when he encountered that sheep, or the little things that nobody watches and nobody sees, the unheralded silent acts, the unsung heroes. Every one of us has that inside of us. And that is the Moses within you. That's ultimately why we read the story. It is true we need a leader. A leader can be an example, a living example. But after everything is said and done, remember, the leader is not about the leader, it's about you and I. It's the empowerment of the grassroots. That's what I discovered and I realized. And I saw it in the Rebbe myself. It was never about him. He never talked about himself. And not only in an intelligent way, sometimes doesn't talk about yourself, but you talk about yourself anyway, in smart ways. You can tell. You know how you can tell? What the results are. I stood in front of this person many times, for many hours. And what I came away with was empowerment. I would not be sitting here and giving this class today were not for this man. What does that tell you? It tells you that it's empowerment. For me, the greatest blessing, if someone tells me, not that you keep coming to my class here every week, which is fine, you're always welcome. But if I hear that you're giving a class somewhere, wherever you are, or in some other way you're spreading light, that's the greatest gift you can tell somebody. It's like when your children have children. That's a sign of perpetuation, of perpetuity, whatever the word is, right? Eternity. And that's something you can't fake. It either happens or it doesn't happen. The true sign of a teacher is not someone who's brilliant and knows how to convey ideas. The true sign of a teacher is when he can make another person a teacher. When the methodology has been passed on and that a tree bears fruits, and those fruits itself become bare trees. And they say one of the great blessings you say, may the fruit of your tree, what does the word expression go? The fruit be as good as you. In other words, a certain type of perpetuation. So I sit here, even though some of you may have not known this man of God, and Moses, a true Moses in our generation, but I did know. And I'm sitting here, so if any of you have ever benefited from me, you're directly benefiting from him. And if he was sitting here, he would tell you, you're directly benefiting from his teacher, who benefited from his teacher, all the way back to Moses. It was never about any individual. That's the bottom line. So people definitely like heroes, We have superheroes, we have sports heroes, we have Hollywood heroes. Sometimes it's escapism, or not sometimes, maybe always. I'm going to live my life through that celluloid hero. But the truth is, and the Torah says it's not about the person, it's about the truth of your life. And if a person came your way and helped inspire that part of you, so you honor that person, but it's never because of the person himself, because he himself will tell you, I was a channel for those that came before me. These are true leaders. And the proof is in the pudding. It's in the results. The results are, do they cultivate followers, dependencies, or they cultivate leaders who can go in their own right and teach and inspire. So of course we miss those that touched us. I miss my father too. He's passed away 4 years ago. Only after a person passes away do you begin to see what kind of influence they had, especially a parent. Not everybody's blessed necessarily with a healthy parent. But my father had many influences, but it's like a foundation. You don't recognize or appreciate the foundation of a building ever. You don't even know what it looks like. When's the last time you saw a foundation? And actually it doesn't really look that good. You see these holes in the city. Foundation, it's like a concrete with a bunch of ragged pipes coming out of it. But without it, there's going to be no structure. We all have a foundation. These are the roots that put you where you are long before you'll ever remember. We're not conscious of our first months, of our first years even. And even when we begin to grow into and have some memories, it's sporadic. These are the true influences in our lives, are the things that are not seen. like the Moses, the shepherd. So when you're able to connect to something like that, it's a very powerful experience. I feel the need, and not more than the need, the honor to mention this evening as the theme of the discussion of leaders. Korach. As I said, we even thank Korach. I mean, the Shpola Zayda said, the Hilik is Zayda Korach. He called the Korach his holy grandfather. Korach had a lot of holiness about him, no question. He had probably made big mistakes too. His biggest mistake was he was too cynical a bit. And his question was right, but it was about the wrong person. If he would have gone to some other leader, well, if he went to Pharaoh, or to some political leader, Dasan and Aviram, and gave this argument, it would have been perfect. The problem is he chose the wrong guy. The right argument with the wrong person. And the wrong person was he chose the humblest one on earth, who, as I said, didn't even defend himself. He chose the real divine person. But Korach was projecting. He was thinking, if I was in power, what would I do? What would I do? I would be in power. I'd sense I'm in power. Moses was not that type of human being. Now, the only argument you can give against this is this really possible? Is it possible to meet such a human being? So I'll tell you like this. Even if you've never met anyone like this, just keep in the back of your mind that there may be a possibility. I'm not saying to let down your guard or to become less cynical or skeptical. But remember, it's not just about you, it's about believing in yourself. Because when I discovered that there is a possibility of a selflessness like that, what it changed in me was, not that I suddenly became selfless in all areas of my life, but I realized that I have that potential too. Because that's the beauty of life. It's not that you become a perfect human being, but you suddenly realize you have potentials you didn't know you have. In a way, it's really a great cop-out, I would say, and it's a great excuse to say, hey, listen, I got a Yetzer Hara, which means an evil inclination, I have temptations, and blah, 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 blah. So whatever I do, I'm already happy. At least I could have been much worse. That's a good way to justify your life. Sometimes you discover something of real beauty and truth. You know what it does? If you're an honest person, you suddenly realize, hey, 1 second. Maybe I'm capable more than I'd like to feel I'm capable of. And then, of course, you become miserable. Because you start saying, I'm not living up to something I can live up to. So no one's asking us to suddenly change the whole picture. But as the Rebbe once said about a certain topic, which is a little dense to discuss here, but I'll just give an example of it, is that when you're, let's say, lacking something, or lacking a certain spiritual sensitivity. So there's a story of a person who lacked that and sat and cried. So you could say, listen, I'm not on that level. I don't cry when I'm lacking spiritual sensitivity. I don't cry when I don't see godliness in this world. I'm more callous than that. So the Rebbe, I remember saying, this was in 1969, said, but you know something, you have no excuse. You should cry for the fact that you're not sensitive enough to cry. And if that's not good enough, you should cry for the fact that you're not sensitive enough to be sensitive enough to cry. And he went through, I don't know how many levels you need, but somewhere, find some measure, some element of innocence that maybe you shouldn't completely become so lost and jaded. It's easy to say, oh, I lost my innocence already, too late for me. That is a very nice approach. You can always say it's also very honest. I'm honest with myself, But sometimes it's also a measure of laziness. They tell the story about a story. The Baal Shem Tov had a custom before Rosh Hashanah. He would go light a certain fire in a particular place, say a prayer for a good new year. Next generation, his student, the Maggid, would go to the same location. He knew about it, but he didn't know how to light the fire quite in the mystical way that the Baal Shem Tov was able to. So he would stand at the place, say the prayers for the new year. And the next generation of his students knew where the location was, but they didn't know how to light the fire, of course. And they also didn't know what prayers to say. So they just stood there. And then the questions are Anan Basrei, what about us? What about us? What do we do? So we don't know how to light the fire. If any one of you does, you probably won't say it. As they say, those that know don't say, and those that say don't know. We don't know what prayers to say. We don't even know the location. So what do? We could say we go to sleep. We have nothing else to do because we're not on that level. The Baal Shem Tov, okay. Maggid, Alter Rebbe. No. You do what you can do. You know what we do? We tell the story. You stay up and you don't go to sleep and tell the story. And if you need to say it a second time, you tell it twice. And if you need to sing a song with it, you sing the song. In other words, everyone on their level. No one's asking us to be Moses. But everyone has their opportunity. You'll see in your life, if you allow yourself, you will have moments where you'll be given this choice. And the temptation will be, I'm not on that level. There are others on that level. And the answer of a true leader is no. We're all on that level. Some of us just have embraced it completely, and some of us embrace it in one little corner of our lives. Everyone's going to have this. And you'll know one more thing, that the choice you make, the right choice, can change your life. Because when you allow yourself to be a little better than you think you are, you'll see it'll also help you in times of crisis. Because let's say, God forbid, illness strikes. Everybody has illness at times. You may lose a job. You may lose opportunity. I mean, everyone's going to have ups and downs in life. And what are you going to do when that happens? Will you also say, I'm not on that level? So the choices you make in strength to be a little more than you think you are, be a leader a little, will also serve you well in the times when you need that, because that too will come back to help you and say, something, you have a little more strength than you do. You ask marathon runners or others who go very grueling circumstances, and those last minutes or the last mile or whatever it may be, the hardest, is when it's the most difficult and you're ready to give up. But there's that extra strength through conditioning or training that gives you the psychological edge to push it through. That cannot happen in a time when you face that challenge. It always comes at another time. And the same thing is with us. You'll be faced with opportunities where you can either so-called minimize your strengths or allow yourself to be flexed and try something a little more than you did. And then you'll see how it serves you in times when you'll need it, when it is grueling. And you'll see you'll have an extra edge, an extra push, an extra surge of energy. And that can literally be the difference between life and death. So it's about the potential that we have. And then when you look and read it of Moses, what we're really expected to do is, I don't have to be this Moses, but in my level, relative to me, there is a part of me that is Moses-like. And am I living up to it? That's what a true Rebbe teaches. And as he would be the first to say, it's what he was taught. And it's not just a statement, don't look at me, look at my teacher. It's real. Because you're dealing with a truth that's beyond any human being. It's a truth of God's. And it's the people that channeled it best are the people who did not allow themselves to get in the way. Transparent channels that allow higher truths to come through them. That's always been the secret of real truth. Resonance. That's what music is. Music touches you. No matter how good I play the music, no matter how good someone else plays the music, it's when it touches you and the music in your soul is when it makes a difference. Obviously, the goal then is that you should play your music, not just listen. And that's really the message here. So Korach teaches us many wise things. The right questions and the right answers, because Korach ultimately elicits the right answer. Yes, there are many leaders that don't deserve to be leaders because they're not holier than anyone else. But then there's the one that emerges in a generation that is that type of soul, that type of selflessness, that empowers people to do what they have to achieve. So I would say, in an evening like this, the greatest blessing and the greatest gift is that each of you and each of us discovers your mission in this world. And not the peripheral one, and not the means to an end, the end itself. What is your mission? Why are you here on this earth? Why was your sacred soul put on this plane for this leg of the journey? What is it that you have to accomplish that no one else, what you can accomplish? With the strengths that come from those before us, we are like midgets that stand on the shoulders of giants. But it's our piece. We carry the baton in this leg of the marathon. And we're told that when you do your little piece, you don't just have your power, you have all the power of those that are with you, and those that were before you, and those that are at your side. And we all need each other in that way. So for me, this is, sometimes you need to restate the mission of the Meaningful Life Center. The mission is to help us each embrace our mission. And sometimes to do that requires only a simple thing, but it's not so simple, which is to cut away the weeds, the distractions. We have plenty of distractions every day. You probably can list them better than I in your life. I could list mine. And cutting away distractions is the key, because then something emerges which is there all the time, just waiting for it to be released. So may that angel be released inside all of us. As I mentioned, and I mention again now, I remember that note I got a little while ago for Rosh Hashanah from the woman who wrote to me that she was going through a very ugly divorce. She was living in Texas, and then moved to Seattle. And she said, in my worst times, the thing that kept me alive, literally that kept me going, was your Friday weekly, she didn't call it diatribes, your weekly thoughts. It gave me a renewed hope. And it's really what kept me going. You never know the life raft, that everyone has their own life raft that they need. So when I write, sometimes I find it hard to write. I always remember that story, among others. You just forge ahead. And then she said to me, so I want to conclude by giving you the blessing, telling you that what you achieved for me is what Michelangelo said, that when they asked him these beautiful sculptures that you sculpt, and how do you create them? He said, I don't create them. I see the angel trapped in the marble, and I carved and set her free. So we all have an angel trapped. Sometimes marble, sometimes worse than marble, concrete, and worse than that. I won't mention all the different type of substances that angels can get trapped in, but there are plenty of them. And the challenge is not to create an angel, it's to just carve away. I know that little just is not, that word just is a very deceptive word, but it is ultimately just, because imagine if you have to go find an angel somewhere. You don't have to find it anywhere. I was blessed to be able to see people, a person, a Rebbe, who saw angels in everyone he looked at. And it helped me a little to see angels also in people I look at. So I don't know how you see yourself, but I see an angel everyone in this room here. That doesn't mean it's not trapped in certain places, but it's still an angel in there, sometimes deeper than others, for some deeper than others. And hopefully we can all help each other release our angels, and then we have a lot of fluttering beauty, magic, musical notes that are released. And imagine if 10 of us can do it, and we all serve as leaders, inspiring that force inside of us and the force of everyone else. Imagine then you just have to multiply it through Facebook or through Twitter or other ways, and you have 6 billion angels floating about. I know it sounds a little naive and utopian, but listen, Marx was able to create utopia images, so can I. And this one has not yet been tested. So let's try it out. It's really about not creating a new type of economy or a new type of capitalism or a new type of socialism or a new type of government. It's really about individuals, because that's what it comes down to. It's not about systems. It's about the empowerment of souls to be able to soar and to fly. That's what real leadership is all about. It's not about the leader. It's about the divine image inside each of us. And a good leader helps us lift ourselves to that place. So I want to conclude with this blessing that each of us should find that angel and lift the rest of us up. You lift me, I'll try to lift you a bit. And in that context, I want to thank the Rebbe himself, who, as I said, I would not be here teaching and doing what I do had I not been inspired, or even more than inspired in that way. And may you have the same inspiration in your own way. And each of us has our sphere of influence and can transform our corner of the world. So with that being said, I'd like to also thank and say this special class was dedicated by Mark Belinsky in honor of his Gimel Tammuz. I don't have the notes here, but say anything else on that? Let me just see. And I invite you all to partner with us in any given way. Yeah, okay. Right. I read it right. To partner with us in any way. You have ideas. Financially is always useful, especially in special times. And then above all, with your souls. We are partners in one large musical composition. And it's always an honor to be here with you. Tomorrow night, Philip, who's right there, I want to introduce Philip, who actually releases musical notes in the real way. He's actually a musician too. Besides the soulful notes. He'll giving his class tomorrow at 7 p.m. here. And thank you. Welcome back, Philip. Philip goes back with me many ways. You can tell you a bunch of little Rabbi Jacobson jokes. meaning when I was younger. And, or Simon Jacobson, however. That's Philip. And stay tuned for much more to come. As I said, a great honor and pleasure to be here. Everyone have a very wonderful night. Thank you so much.